In this video, you're going to learn how to create a linear gradient mask using Lightroom. So let's talk a little bit about linear gradients and what they are, how you create them using Lightroom before we actually do the demonstration. Linear gradients are used to adjust gradually along a straight line. They essentially act as a graduated filter that you might have on your camera. So they kind of take the place of graduated filter in some ways. They are ideal for skies as well as foregrounds. And they can be placed anywhere on your photo. Typically, I don't want to say typically, but most commonly, they're probably placed from top down in order to use the mask for a sky. Some people like to use them in their foregrounds as well. So you can draw it from the bottom up. You can draw them from the sides. And then you can also adjust the angle, adjust the position, and you can adjust the feathering as well. All right, so when you initially draw a linear gradient, the first thing you need to do is decide whether you want straight lines or angled lines. And if you want a straight line, for example, if you're going to draw from top down, typically that would be used to create a mask for your sky. And so to do that, you're going to need to make sure you hold the Shift key down on your keyboard when you draw the linear gradient. If you don't hold the Shift key down, then you're not going to get straight lines. Which is sometimes exactly what you want. Sometimes you want to draw a linear gradient at an angle. You can see that on the left-hand side of the screen. Maybe you've got just a piece of the sky coming in from the right side, upper right-hand corner of your sky, of your photo. And so you might have a situation where you want an angled linear gradient, and so you can easily do that. You just want to make sure you don't hold the Shift key down, and then you'll drag it from the corner in which you want to create it. And then once the linear gradient has been created, you do have the ability to either expand or compress the lines, and that will ultimately affect the linear gradient mask that gets created. So we'll talk more about those three lines. You're going to have the central line, which is the line in the middle. You'll notice it has a blue dot, or not a blue dot, but kind of a blue square. That's the midpoint of the gradient. And so what you'll see is that the mask is applied evenly up until the midpoint of the gradient. And then as you move further down towards the bottom line, what you're doing there is you're getting a transition. So the transition begins at that line and begins to fade out as it moves down to the bottom line. You can also move the entire gradient around just by picking up the blue square and just simply moving it with your cursor or your trackpad. So you do have the ability to move it as needed. And then you've got top and bottom lines as well. These lines are used to determine how gradually the adjustment will fade. And you remember that the gradient is going to be consistent up until the midpoint, and then it gradually fades out. So the bottom line is the key here. And so the wider the space between the midpoint and the bottom line, the wider that is, the softer, more gradual transition you will have. If you pull that bottom line up to where it's going towards meeting the center line, then you're going to have a sharper, more abrupt gradient. All right, so from here what we'll do is I'll actually bring up Lightroom and we'll go through a demo that shows you how to create the linear gradients and be able to work with those. Okay, so for this demonstration, what I'll do is just start with a white background like I've done with all the demonstrations concerning the different masks in Lightroom. And again, the reason for that is it just helps you visualize the masks better, the different types of masks a little bit better. It just kind of aids in the learning process for understanding what each of these masks are, what they do, and how you control some of the different settings. So let's go ahead and bring up the Create Mask pane. I've got a leftover mask here that I'm going to delete real quick. And we'll create a linear gradient mask. And I'm going to hold the Shift key down, right? So if I don't hold the Shift key down, I'm not going to get a straight line, but in this case, I will hold the Shift key down, and all you have to do to create this is simply to drag downward or upward if you're going from bottom to top, and then release, right? And so now you have your three lines, and again, this acts like essentially like a graduated filter, right? And so the mask itself is going to be applied equally up until the middle line or the midpoint, and then it gradually transitions out. Now the default like we have here, a fairly wide spacing, so it's a very gradual transition where you're fading the mask out as you're moving towards the bottom line. Now, you can always pick this up and move it if you wanted to reposition. As all you have to do is use your mouse or your trackpad to move the entire linear gradient, should you want to do that. So that's essentially what it is for a linear gradient mask. Now the bottom line, if you move it up, if you push that up towards the midpoint, then you are decreasing that transition zone. So you're simply decreasing the transition zone with when you've got less distance between that bottom line and the middle line. And of course, as you expand that, then you increase that masking gradient. All right, let me go ahead and delete this, and then I'm going to recreate the mask. Just delete that just to start over. And need to zoom out just a little bit here. So I'm going to create a linear gradient again. This time, I'm not going to hold the shift key down. So that means I'm not necessarily going to get a straight line, right, unless you're really steady with it. But we'll go ahead and click linear gradient. And then this time, I'm not going to hold the shift key down. And you'll notice how that line kind of can be rotated as needed. And so this is good for situations where you want to create a linear gradient at some type of angle. Now, the same concepts will apply. You can still pick the midpoint up and move the mask should you need to do that. Of course, you can decrease the space between the bottom, in this case the top line and the midline, to decrease the space covered by the mask as well as the transition zone. And so concept is the same, but in this case, because I have not held the shift key down, I have the ability to rotate this. And again, this is primarily used for situations where you're looking to create some type of linear gradient at an angle. All right, so now that we've seen kind of how the linear gradient works, what we'll do in the next demonstration is show you how to create a linear gradient mask on an actual photo. All right, so that's coming up. Okay, so let's turn our attention to creating a linear gradient mask on an actual photo now that you understand the basics of linear gradients and how to create them and how to manipulate them, how to control the different settings. So here we have a photo with a fair amount of sky, and it's often the case that you'd want to apply a linear gradient mask to the sky. And so what we'll do is go ahead and create that new linear gradient. And again, I'm going to hold the shift key down because I want to draw a straight line here. I don't really want an angled linear gradient mask in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and hold my shift key down and then simply drag until I'm satisfied with what I've created. And again, you may need to adjust this just to kind of suit your needs. And but again, these are very easy to create. Now, in terms of visualizing this, it may be easier to change it from your mask overlay mode from color overlay to something else so that you can see this a little bit better. We kind of flip through some of these. So here, this image on black, and image on black seems like it works the best. But the image on black kind of gives you a pretty good idea of what is covered by this linear gradient mask. So most of it covers the sky. Some of it bleeds over into the horizon, the landscape, the land, the hills and the land that abut up against the sky. But in this case, that's okay, I think. And it's not a huge issue if it bleeds over a little bit into the landscape. If it is an issue, you can always clean it up by simply using subtract and subtracting out everything that's not the sky. That can be done as well. But it's pretty easy to create, right? And so at this point, then you can begin to apply your changes. So you might want to damp down the exposure a little bit here, up the contrast just a bit. Whatever it is you want to do here. So I'll bring down the whites just a little bit. And that looks pretty good. All right, so linear gradients are one of the easier types of masks to create in Lightroom. And again, they're used in very specific circumstances. Most of the time they're used for skies where you're looking to create a linear gradient. They can also be used in the foreground as well. So you could very easily create another mask that covers the foreground of this photo, and then you could use that linear gradient mask to make your changes to that linear gradient mask as well. But the most common scenario where you're going to use these is on your skies. And keep in mind, right, you can add these in as angles as well. If you don't, maybe sometimes you just have a piece of the sky in one corner of your photo. And so it might make more sense to add in your linear gradient at an angle as well. That's possible too. So, all right, so that is it for now. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll talk to you again soon.